July 1st, 1944, Hollandia Air Base, Netherlands, New Guinea. The air is a thick, wet blanket, smelling of mud, diesel exhaust, and tropical rot. On the crushed coral runway, 4 P-38 Lightning fighters touch down, their distinctive twin booms shimmering in the oppressive heat. They have been airborne for 6.5 hours, a grueling endurance run deep over enemy-held territory. 3 pilots climb out, stiff and exhausted, their flight suits soaked through. They walk away from their aircraft with the weary relief of men who have once again cheated the ocean. Their fuel gauges read nearly empty. In their tanks, perhaps 50 gallons remain. A razor-thin margin separating a safe landing from a silent, fatal glide into the vast Pacific. The 4th aircraft, however, is different. It was flown by a 42-year-old civilian, a quiet man in Navy khakis. As the ground crew chief runs his fuel stick into the tanks, his expression shifts from routine to disbelief. He pulls the stick, checks the reading, and checks it again, convinced the numbers must be wrong. The 4th P-38 still shows 210 gallons of fuel remaining. Same mission, same weather, same airplane. Somehow, this one pilot had used 200 gallons less fuel than the best, most experienced fighter pilots in the Pacific theater. For months, American aviators had been flying these twin-engine interceptors exactly as the manuals demanded. They were drilled, from their first days in flight school, on the sanctity of engine management. The standard cruise setting was doctrine. 2200 RPM, mixture controls pushed forward to auto-rich. They followed these procedures with religious devotion, for they had been taught that deviating from them would destroy their complex, turbocharged Allison V-1710 engines. The cardinal sin, the one that guaranteed catastrophe, was running Oversquare, a condition of high manifold pressure combined with low propeller RPM. Instructors and technical orders warned it was aviation suicide, a surefire way to induce detonation, burn pistons, and tear the power plants from their mountings. But standing on that New Guinea airstrip, staring at fuel readings that defied everything the Army Air Forces believed, one question hung in the humid air, heavy and unspoken. What if everything they had been taught about flying was wrong? The checker game had been going on for 20 minutes when the knock came at the screen door. Colonel Charles MacDonald, commander of the 475th Fighter Group, barely glanced up. His mind, accustomed to calculating fighter intercepts and fuel margins, was focused on the red and black squares. The afternoon heat pressed down on their makeshift headquarters at Hollandia, a crude structure that offered little defense against the climate. Across from him, Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith sat equally absorbed. The game was an improvised diversion, one of the few available in this remote, sodden corner of the war. "Excuse me, gentlemen. Excuse me, gentlemen." The voice was quiet, yet carried an authority that made MacDonald finally look toward the doorway. A middle-aged man stood there, unremarkable in appearance. He wore simple navy khakis, crisp despite the humidity. He was, by all appearances, a civilian. "I'm Charles Lindberg." MacDonald's hand froze halfway to a checker. The name hung in the air, electric and out of place, like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Smith's eyes widened. MacDonald, at 29, was a combat commander, but he stared at this man, trying to reconcile the legend with the reality. This was that Charles Lindberg, the one who had flown the Spirit of St. Louis solo to Paris 17 years prior. He was the man who had transformed flying from a circus stunt into a genuine means of transportation. "General Hutchinson sent me," Lindbergh continued, stepping into their cramped quarters. "He thought I might be able to discuss P-38 combat operations with you." MacDonald stood slowly, the checker game entirely forgotten. He was, officially, Mr. Lindbergh. The famous aviator had resigned his Air Corps commission in 1941 under political pressure. He was in the Pacific not as a soldier, but as a civilian technical representative for the United Aircraft Corporation, the manufacturer of the F-4U Corsair. He had just come from Guadalcanal, where he had been helping the Marines troubleshoot their bent-winged bird. His presence at an Army P-38 base was driven by a different corporate objective. United Aircraft was investigating the feasibility of a new twin-engined fighter, and the P-38 was the only American aircraft of its type in service. But Lindbergh had his own personal mission. He had secured observer status from General Kenny, who had, with a wink, granted him authorization to fly combat missions and fire his guns only in self-defense. "Of course, Mr. Lindbergh. Please sit down." McConnell gestured to a folding chair and then called for Colonel Warren Lewis. If they were going to discuss P-38 operations, Lewis, the commanding officer of the 433rd Fighter Squadron, needed to be there. He, more than anyone, understood the crushing mathematics of their current situation. Lewis arrived minutes later, his flight suit still damp. He took one look at their visitor, and his professional composure cracked. "Mr. Lindbergh, what brings you to our little corner of paradise?" The irony was thick. Paradise, if it consisted of metal hangars baking in the sun, mud that never dried, and the constant, maddening buzz of insects. "I'm here to learn," Lindbergh replied simply, "and perhaps to share some observations about long-range flying." Lewis settled into a chair, as MacDonald could see him mentally shifting into briefing mode. "Well, Mr. Lindbergh, our situation is pretty straightforward. We're flying missions that push every limit these aircraft have." The colonel pulled out a worn map, spreading it across the desk and pushing the checkerboard aside. His finger traced routes across hundreds of miles of empty, blue Pacific water. Tiny, insignificant islands dotted the map, islands that represented life-or-death navigation points for pilots flying over an endless ocean. 6.5 to 7 hours, Lewis continued, his voice measured. "That's what we're asking of these boys. Missions that were impossible a year ago are routine. And the fuel margins—" He shook his head. MacDonald watched Lindbergh study the map. The aviator's pale blue eyes moved systematically, calculating distances with the precision of a man who had spent decades thinking about range and endurance. It was the look of a pilot who understood that fuel was not just a number on a gauge. It was time, it was distance, and ultimately, it was survival. "The P-38L has a published combat radius of 570 miles, Lewis explained. "In practice, we are pushing that envelope on every single mission. Standard procedure calls for 2,200 to 2,400 RPM, auto-rich mixture settings. Fuel consumption runs over 100 gallons per hour total." Lindbergh nodded slowly, his expression one not of confusion, but of recognition. "These boys come back exhausted," Lewis said. 7 hours in that cockpit is torture, sitting on a parachute, an emergency raft, and an oar. But the physical strain is one thing, the mental pressure. He gestured to the map. Every mission brief becomes a fuel calculation. How much reserve? How long can we stay over target? What's our absolute point of no return?
McLaughlin had seen that pressure firsthand. He had watched pilots, some barely 21, hunched over flight tables with slide rules, calculating the margins that determined whether they would see another sunrise. Too many good men had already been lost to empty tanks rather than enemy bullets. The mathematics were unforgiving. Run out of fuel over the Pacific, and rescue was impossible. "And it's getting worse," Lewis added. "The targets keep getting farther away. Rabaul, Wewak. Now we're talking about missions deep into the Philippines." This was the strategic nightmare. The island-hopping campaign demanded ever longer legs. Landings at Hollandia and Etape, just months earlier, had been effectively outside the range of ground-based fighter cover. In Europe, unescorted B-17s and B-24s were suffering unsustainable losses. Without long-range escort, the entire strategic bombing campaign in the Pacific was in jeopardy. Lindbergh listened, occasionally asking specific technical questions about mixture, prop pitch, and cruise altitudes. His queries revealed a depth of knowledge that surprised MacDonald. This was not a celebrity asking polite questions. This was an engineer who understood power plant management at a level most combat flyers never reached. He knew what the pilots did not. He knew that the very doctrine they followed was flawed. He had observed that pilots were flying at high RPM, low manifold pressure, and, critically, in auto-rich. They were, as he would later note, using nearly the worst possible combination for range. The Allison engine, he knew, was actually more fuel-efficient than its famous Merlin counterpart at low power settings. But the pilots, through their training, were wasting that advantage, burning fuel unnecessarily with every passing minute. "Have you experimented with different cruise settings?" Lindbergh asked finally. Lewis and MacDonald exchanged a glance. "The technical orders are pretty specific," Lewis replied carefully. "We follow standard procedures. High RPM, rich mixtures. That's what keeps these Allisons running." A slight, almost imperceptible shift occurred in Lindbergh's expression. It was the look of a man hearing conventional wisdom that he knew, with absolute certainty, to be false. "Mr. Lindbergh," MacDonald said slowly, "you mentioned observations about long-range flying. What kind of observations?" For the first time, Lindbergh smiled. "Would you be interested in a practical demonstration? I checked out in the P-38 a few days ago. I'd like to join one of your combat missions." The request hung in the humid air. MacDonald felt the weight of command. Taking a civilian, America's most famous and controversial civilian, on a combat operation was a risk that went far beyond normal mission parameters. But something in the man's quiet confidence suggested this was not idle curiosity. This was the man who had crossed the Atlantic alone. He knew something they did not. "What did you have in mind?" MacDonald asked. The recreation hall at Hollandia was a dump. A packed dirt floor, a palm thatch roof that leaked, and a single ping-pong table. Unshaded light bulbs cast harsh shadows, making every face look older and more tired. MacDonald surveyed the assembled pilots of the 475th Fighter Group. 43 men, most under 25, all wearing the 1,000-yard stare that came from too many hours over hostile territory, their eyes constantly flicking to their fuel gauges. "Gentlemen," MacDonald began, "Mr. Lindbergh has something he wants to share about extending our range capabilities." Lindbergh stepped forward. He wore the same Navy khakis, absent of any regulation insignia. He moved with the unconscious grace of a man who had spent his life around aircraft. He wasted no time. "Reduce your standard 2200 RPM to 1600, he said, his voice cutting through the room. No preamble, no context, just the technical specification that would either save their lives or destroy their engines. Set fuel mixtures to auto-lean instead of auto-rich. Increase manifold pressures slightly to compensate." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of dozens of pilots trying to reconcile what they had just heard with years of training. Lieutenant Bobby Johnson, one of the steadiest leaders, raised his hand. "Sir, are you saying we can cut RPM down to 1600 and use 30 inches of mercury manifold pressure?" "That's correct," Lindbergh replied. "The fuel savings run between 50 and 100 gallons per mission." The silence deepened. MacDonald watched his pilots' faces. He saw hope, because longer range meant better survival odds and the ability to reach targets that were, until now, untouchable. And he saw horror. Captain Jim Watkins voiced what everyone was thinking. "Mr. Lindbergh, that's going to burn up our engines. We've always been told that low RPM with high manifold pressure causes detonation." This was the core of their terror. Oversquare operation was the ultimate taboo. The technical manuals were filled with dire warnings. The most common pilot error, the one guaranteed to produce detonation and subsequent engine failure, was pushing the throttles wide open, high manifold pressure, before increasing the RPM. On the Allison's power charts, the danger detonation range was clearly plotted for any high-power, low RPM combination. The engines themselves were complex. Unlike later fighters with single-lever controls, the P-38's Allison required the pilot to manually and separately manage the throttle, the propeller RPM, and the fuel mixture. A procedural error was fatally easy to make. The standing rule, drilled into them like a prayer, was increase RPM first, then manifold pressure. Decrease manifold pressure first, then RPM. Lindbergh's proposal seemed to violate this sacred pact. The pilots' chief concern, the one they muttered to each other, was that this technique would foul spark plugs and scorch cylinders. "You've been told wrong," Lindbergh interrupted, his voice quiet but absolute. He explained that their fear was based on high power settings, like war emergency power. What he was proposing was a low-power cruise technique. It worked by maximizing the engine's gear reduction, low RPM, against a moderate power setting. It let the turbochargers do the work efficiently in the leanest part of the power band. Then he delivered his trump card. The technique wasn't even new. He motioned toward the aircraft's technical manual. The procedure, he explained, had been there all along. Buried in the charts, under maximum range cruise, were settings the pilots had never been trained to use. 1600 RPM and 26 inches of manifold pressure. They had been taught a single, inefficient, maximum cruise setting, and had, through habit, made it even worse by using auto-rich. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, barely 22, did the math aloud. 70 gallons an hour versus our current 100 plus, that's almost a 30% reduction. More than that, Lindbergh replied. He laid out the new reality. His technique, he predicted, would stretch the Lightning's range by 400 miles. It would enable a 9-hour flight. The combat radius would extend from 570 miles to 700, possibly 750 miles, all while keeping a 1-hour fuel reserve. The numbers were staggering. A 750-mile radius meant deep strikes into Japanese-held territory that were currently impossible. But the resistance ran deeper than mathematics. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, who had been silent, finally spoke. "Mr. Lindbergh, you're asking us to fly 9-hour missions. 7 hours in a lightning cockpit is already torture." He was right. The pilots, already sitting on their parachutes, rafts, and survival gear, referred to long missions as bum busters. The prospect of 9 hours seemed inconceivable. Lindbergh acknowledged the challenge. "The endurance challenge is legitimate," he said, "but consider the alternative. How many pilots have you lost to fuel starvation? How many missions have been aborted because fuel margins didn't allow sufficient time over target?" The question struck home. Every man in that room knew the answer. Too many. "The choice," Lindbergh continued quietly, "isn't between comfort and discomfort. It's between proven techniques that extend your operational capability and conventional methods that are limiting your effectiveness." MacDonald studied the faces around him. They were veterans, pragmatists who understood survival. "Mr. Lindbergh," MacDonald said finally, "would you be willing to demonstrate this technique on an actual combat mission?" The morning of July 3rd, 0530. The mission was a 1,280-mile round trip, a patrol with possible ground attack opportunities. Major Thomas "Tommy" Maguire, the second highest scoring American ace of the war and commander of the 431st Fighter Squadron, volunteered to fly Lindbergh's wing. Maguire was skeptical, but as he told his men, he would like to see what the old guy could do. Lindbergh emerged from the operations tent. He wore civilian flying boots with his borrowed flight suit. He climbed into his cockpit with practiced efficiency, taking extra time with his fuel and propeller controls. Unlike standard procedure, he set his mixtures to auto-lean before engine start. The 4 P-38s lifted off. As they climbed to cruise altitude, the demonstration began. Lindbergh's voice came over the radio, a calm, technical monotone. "Reducing RPM to 1600. Manifold pressure 30 inches. Mixture auto-lean." MacDonald, flying lead, kept his own aircraft at regulation settings, 2200 RPM, auto-rich. His fuel flow instruments showed the expected burn rate, approximately 104 gallons per hour. Beside him, Lindbergh's aircraft, running on radically different settings, maintained identical airspeed and altitude. The first hour passed. Then, at the 90-minute mark, Maguire's voice broke the radio silence. "Lead, I'm showing fuel flow approximately 20% below normal for this phase of flight." MacDonald was stunned. Maguire was flying standard settings. But simply watching Lindbergh's technique and unconsciously adopting more efficient power management was already saving him fuel. The psychological effect was immediate. 2 hours into the mission, they found their targets, Japanese barges anchored in a cove. "Lightning flight, this is lead. Target area ahead." MacDonald pushed his throttles forward. The engines roared, and fuel flow jumped to maximum. For 12 minutes, the engagement was a frenzy of high-speed passes, strafing runs, and defensive brakes to avoid anti-aircraft fire. Lindbergh maintained formation throughout, his aircraft responding normally to combat power demands. After, they climbed back to cruise altitude. MacDonald reset his engines to standard cruise and called for a fuel check. He had 60% remaining. 2 showing 60%, Maguire replied. 3, 58%. Then Lindbergh's voice, calm and quiet. 4, 72% remaining. MacDonald was certain he had misheard.
72%? After 2 hours of cruise and 12 minutes of full-power combat? 4. Say again fuel remaining? 72% confirmed, Lindbergh replied. Fuel flow during cruise has averaged approximately 70 gallons per hour total. The mathematics were undeniable. While McDonnell's aircraft had consumed roughly 200 gallons, Lindbergh had used only 140 for the identical mission. The 30% reduction was exactly as he had promised. The return flight confirmed it. By the time Hollandia came into sight, McDonnell was calculating fuel margins that seemed luxurious. The landing revealed the full extent of the victory. Ground crews swarmed the planes with their dipsticks. McDonnell had returned with 18% fuel. Adequate, but with no room for error. Lindbergh climbed out of his cockpit with 34% of his fuel, more than 600 gallons still in his tanks. On another, similar 6.5-hour mission, the results were even more stark. After other pilots broke off, low on fuel, Lindbergh received permission to continue hunting barges. He landed with 260 gallons remaining. His wingman, a driver from Maguire's squadron who had adopted the technique late in the flight, landed with only 70. The difference was 190 gallons. Lindbergh was saving, on average, nearly 29 gallons of fuel every hour. The skepticism cracked first among the ground crews. They were men who dealt in physical reality, not theory. Technical Sergeant Mike Kowalski, who had worked on P-38s since before Pearl Harbor, understood fuel consumption through the daily, meticulous observation of numbers that never lied. After the 5th consecutive mission where Lindbergh's fuel consumption ran 30% below standard, Kowalski approached McDonnell. "Colonel, sir," he said, wiping grease from his hands, "either this civilian's got magic engines or everything we've been taught about cruise settings is wrong." The pilots proved more stubborn. The psychological weight of their training was immense. Lieutenant Hayes, the young pilot who had first calculated the savings, volunteered for a training flight to try the technique. He returned visibly shaken. "It felt wrong the entire time, sir," he reported, "like waiting for something to explode." The engines, pilots found, ran rough at these settings. The technique prioritized economy over smoothness. But Hayes's fuel gauges didn't care about his comfort. They recorded the mathematical reality, a 73-gallon-per-hour burn rate. Major Pete Peterson, a veteran of the brutal missions over Rabaul, represented the Old Guard's final stand. "Mr. Lindbergh," he said during a heated discussion, "you're asking us to bet our lives on techniques that go against everything we know about engine management." The fear was not unfounded. On other aircraft, like the P-51 Mustang, aggressive fuel leaning was known to be murder on engines, often resulting in severe piston burning. Lindbergh's response was patient. "Major, what you know about engine management comes from training designed for different operational requirements. Short-duration flights, maximum power settings. These missions," he gestured to the maps, "demand efficiency techniques that weren't part of your standard curriculum." The breakthrough, the moment the dam of resistance finally broke, came on July 28, 1944. The mission was a long-range bomber escort and fighter sweep to Amboina Island. Intelligence warned of heavy opposition. Lindbergh was flying on Maguire's wing, where the squadron's most aggressive ace could observe him during actual aerial combat. The B-25 bombers they were escorting encountered impenetrable weather and aborted the mission. McDonnell, leading the 433rd Possum Squadron, made a different call. With Lindbergh, he led his flights above the Thunderheads, climbing to 18,000 feet, and pushed on.
Near Amahai, they spotted a dogfight already in progress. It was a swirling melee. P-38s from the 49th Fighter Group were desperately trying to shoot down two Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonyas. The Japanese pilots, Captain Saburo Shimada and Sergeant Sanayoshi Yokogi, were masters. They flew like demons, frustrating the 49ers, forcing them to expend their ammunition in futile, high-G turns. Just as McDonald's flight arrived, the 49ers finally splashed Sergeant Yokogi. Captain Shimada, his aircraft smoking after a burst from McDonald's guns, was now alone, trapped and under attack by a fresh flight of Lightnings. He made his choice. He decided to fight. He banked furiously and lined up on the next P-38 in his sights. It was Lindbergh. The two aircraft hurtled toward each other in a head-on attack, their closing speed over 500 miles per hour. Lindbergh, who had never before seen an enemy aircraft in combat, sighted on the Sonya's radial engine and held down the triggers. His P-38 bucked as its 4 machine guns and 20mm cannon tore into the Japanese plane. He saw his tracers strike the engine, and the enemy's propeller perceptibly slowed. But Shimada refused to break off. Moments before impact, Lindbergh yanked back on the yoke in a violent, evasive maneuver. Shimada's aircraft zoomed suddenly upward with extraordinary sharpness, passing Lindbergh's canopy by mere feet, probably less than that. As Lindbergh climbed, he looked back. He saw the Sonya tip over into a wingover, out of control, pouring smoke. As it fell, Lindbergh's wingman, Lieutenant Joseph Fishkiller Miller, snapped off a final burst that ripped pieces from its wing. Captain Shimada's gallant fight, as MacDonald would later call it, was over. Lindbergh had his first and only aerial victory of the war. But the true victory was tactical. The mission had lasted over 8 hours, including extended, fuel-guzzling combat maneuvering at maximum power. Standard fuel planning would have left most pilots calculating glide ratios or ditching in the sea. Instead, they landed at Hollandia with fuel reserves that seemed opulent. MacDonald touched down with enough fuel for another hour of flight. Maguire, who had been experimenting with the settings, reported similar margins. Lindbergh's gauges showed quantities that were still impossible, enough fuel remaining for nearly 2 additional hours of flight. The ground crews, led by Sergeant Kowalski, swarmed the engines. This was the ultimate test. Had 8 hours of wrong flying, capped by a violent dogfight, destroyed the Allisons? They found no damage, no unusual wear, no mechanical problems. In fact, Kowalski's detailed examinations began to show the opposite. The engines run with Lindbergh settings, at lower combustion temperatures and with reduced mechanical stress, were showing less wear than comparable aircraft. The fears of scorched cylinders and fouled spark plugs were not just wrong, they were the opposite of the truth. That evening, Major Peterson approached MacDonald. The veteran's skepticism was gone, replaced by the grudging respect of a professional who had seen undeniable evidence. "Colonel," Peterson said, "I'd like to request permission to try Mr. Lindbergh's techniques on tomorrow's patrol mission." The dam had broken. Within a week, every pilot in the 475th was experimenting with reduced RPMs and auto-lean mixtures. The results were consistent: 30% fuel savings, extended range, and no mechanical failures. By August 1944, the revolution was complete. What had begun as a civilian's controversial suggestion was now standard operating procedure. Flight manuals were hastily revised. Technical orders were rewritten. Instructors back in the United States found themselves teaching techniques that directly contradicted everything they had learned. The change was immediate and strategic. MacDonald stood in the operations tent looking at mission planning boards that would have been fantasy just months earlier. The new reality: 950-mile round trips to Balikpapan, Borneo. Balikpapan was one of Japan's most critical sources of aviation fuel, a target previously believed to be invulnerable to fighter escort. Before, unescorted B-24s had flown grueling 17-hour, 2,700-mile missions to hit it. Now, the 475th's P-38s could fly escort for them, a life-saving capability that crippled Japan's war effort. The P-38's combat radius had jumped from 570 miles to over 750. Its maximum flight time increased by 40%. The P-38 Lightning, with its newfound range, had no equivalent in either camp. Colonel Lewis reported on an 8-hour escort mission to Borneo as if it were routine. Lieutenant Hayes, the pilot who had once been visibly shaken, now reported returning from a 9-hour combat mission with an hour of fuel still in reserve. Even the human factor, the bumbuster complaint, evaporated. Pilots discovered that the reduced engine noise and vibration from the lower RPM settings decreased their fatigue on long flights. Major Maguire became the technique's most effective advocate. The old way of thinking about fuel management was killing us, he told other squadron leaders. Not through mechanical failure, but through self-imposed limitations. Lindbergh's work was done. His aerial victory, combined with his participation in a hazardous 1,200-mile sweep to Palau, had made him too high profile. On August 13, 1944, General Kenny, fearing the diplomatic fallout if America's most famous civilian was shot down or captured, formally grounded him and sent him home. He left behind a transformed Air Force. MacDonald's final report quantified the revolution in terms that strategic planners understood. Combat radius, extended by 31%. Fuel consumption, reduced by 30%. Mission duration, increased by 40%. These numbers translated into tactical advantages that changed the course of the Pacific Air War. Pilot survival rates improved as fuel-related emergencies plummeted. Mission success rates increased. Japanese installations, once protected by the tyranny of distance, were now vulnerable. The lesson was simple, profound, and written in the logbooks of pilots who now had the one thing they needed more than ammunition: time. Sometimes the experts are wrong, and sometimes saving fuel means winning battles.